Hi Archers! Patch 1.4.9 brought a lot of changes for the current abilities we have in ARCHERO. Because the changes were so major, this also changed how some of our current heroes worked. In this video, I'll be showing you all the new stats and changes for some of our heroes. My name is Teeds. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe and click the bell for more videos. I tested each hero twice with different abilities and different weapons to understand how their abilities work now. This is based on my research and my numbers. If you haven't seen the changes and stats of the abilities yet, I'll leave a link to my video in the description box below. Some of these changes are pretty big, so I will make a new hero tier list as well in the future. The heroes that have changed are TARANIS, Bonnie, PHOREN, ROLLA, URASIL, SYLVAN, and Shade. Archeros, Helix, Magic, Shari, and ONIR remain the same. Alright, let's begin. First, TARANIS. TARANIS' special ability is based on the ability BOUT Arrow, and dealt 30% of your base damage and did not deal any initial damage to targets. The regular BOUT ability that we can all get has been buffed from 25% to 30% and now deals initial damage to the target. The buff for TARANIS is pretty big. TARANIS now deals initial damage to the target, and he can deal up to 45% of his base damage. So his special ability is similar to Ricochet. It will chain to the nearby enemies of your target. I found that TARANIS has 3 different values which change depending on the circumstance. From my testing, TARANIS will always deal 30% of your base damage to nearby enemies and deals 30% initial damage to the targets that are alone. The value increases the more enemies are nearby your target. If there is 1 enemy nearby your target, TARANIS will deal 35% initial damage. If there is 2 enemies nearby, he will deal 40% initial damage, and enemies 3 or more nearby will have TARANIS deal 45% initial damage to the target. This is a huge buff for TARANIS and makes him a lot better than before. From dealing 30% of his base damage to nearby targets and not dealing any initial damage, to now scaling up to 45% of his base damage to initial targets and having all nearby targets hit for 30%. While the value for nearby targets stay the same, dealing initial damage is a big thing for TARANIS. I tested TARANIS with 2 different weapons, and his lightning damage does not scale with weapon modifiers. His damage does scale with multi-shot and front arrow, so picking up these abilities will unfortunately lower his lightning damage. However, they do scale with attack boost, so you can make it stronger. Having multi-shot will not proc the lightning twice. It will only proc with the first shot, and I believe there is a quick cooldown in between, which is why the second shot is not considered. Next, Bonnie. Bonnie is one of the heroes that was somewhat disappointing. Bonnie costs real money and her special ability had quite a few cons and flaws. Her ability is based off Shadow Clone. Shadow Clone and her special ability will now spawn without having to kill an enemy. This may be based on enemy hit. This means her ability is now useful against bosses. According to a Google document made by the user Pure, Bonnie's clones have a 15% chance to spawn, 1 max per enemy in a room, 3 clones max per boss room, and 15 clones at once in levels. Clones last for 10 seconds. I found that Bonnie's clones will now deal 150% of your base damage. This is a 50% damage increase. Her clone's damage is not affected by attack boost, multi-shot, front arrow, and weapon modifiers. In my opinion, I find this to be a huge buff for Bonnie. I actually enjoy Bonnie, but she wasn't pushed chapter material, and I used her more for farming wave chapters instead. She is much more viable now than before, and players who would like to push chapters of Bonnie should have an easier time than before with this change. However, since her clones do not gain any benefit from boost, there is not much damage increase and higher potential for Bonnie. Next, PHOREN. PHOREN's special ability is based off the ability Blaze, which is a fire burning ticking ability. Blaze has been buffed from 15% to 18%. PHOREN's special ability has also changed from 15% to 18%. The only difference back then and now is the amount of ticks. PHOREN's change was a little strange to me. For some reason they have changed the tick time from 10 to 9. Instead of ticking for 2 seconds, it now ticks for 1.5 seconds. So I am unsure if this is a buff or a nerf or just something in between. The ability does not change with the weapon modifier, multi-shot, front arrow, and attack boost. While PHOREN is a pretty strong free hero as his damage is one of the most least circumstantial, the previous changes for other heroes might actually kick PHOREN down some tiers. I don't really know yet without doing the testing and numbers, but that is just my opinion right now from the changes that I have, so take this statement lightly. Next is ROLLA. ROLLA's change in my opinion is impressive. ROLLA's special ability is based off the ability Freeze. Freeze and Rolla's ability at first did not deal any damage and only froze targets for a short duration. This has changed, and Freeze now deals damage to targets. Rolla's ability froze targets for half a second and dealt no damage. This has now changed and it is 12% of your base damage. The freeze is still half a second. 12% sounds really little, I know, but it actually makes, in my opinion, a huge difference for Rolla. Rolla has the highest base attack in the game, along with Shade. Rolla's freeze is pretty underrated. I do find her strong, but it's also hard to prove with calculations. Freeze works by cancelling attacks of enemies and for a short duration makes them immobile. While you cannot really calculate what the result of that is, it does result in less attacks from the enemy, less repositioning from yourself, and in turn means you can focus on attacking the enemies more. While it was nice that she had freeze, I found that it was still somewhat lacking and I think the damage was needed. I understand why it's not a huge damage increase, but it does make a difference with how it works. Rolla's freeze damage does scale with attack boosts. This means that you can reach higher damage potential from her freeze. I tested this in a full chapter 11 run and I only had equipped one perfect epic bow, one armor and locket for the health and nothing else. I reached almost 1000 damage with her freeze, and because she has the highest base attack, I was hitting very hard. Rolla's freeze unfortunately does scale with multi-shot and front arrow, so your freeze damage will be less when you pick up these items. I also wanted to test the ability with Ricochet because damage decreases each enemy bounce on Ricochet. All enemies that were hit with Ricochet still took the full damage of her freeze, and multiple targets were left frozen as well. In my opinion, Ricochet plus Rolla is very powerful. Out of all the changes so far, while some of them are really amazing, Rolla for me was impressive. I personally felt that the small change for Rolla made such a big difference. It was incredible to see how much better she was than before, and now that she has numbers I can do some calculations, but still, it's hard to calculate what a player would do with her freeze windows. Next, URASIL. URASIL's damage is based off the ability Poison. The old URASIL dealt 40% of your base damage and it is now changed to a 12% initial poison hit and then 45% ongoing. Not a major change, but still a lot better than before and makes him a bit more viable. Does not scale with attack boost, not affected by multi-shot and front arrow, and not affected by weapon modifiers. This leaves no room for higher damage potential within his special ability. Next, SYLVAN. So there were a lot of changes to all elemental arrows which in turn should affect SYLVAN too. SYLVAN makes use of Blaze, Freeze, Bolt, and Poison. All of these normal abilities have been changed. Here is what I found with SYLVAN with my testing. SYLVAN's Fire stayed the same at 35% per tick, no damage increase. SYLVAN's Poison now deals 12% initial damage and then 70% ongoing tick damage until enemy death. This one has changed. Previously, SYLVAN's Poison did not deal any initial damage, and the damage of the ongoing poison is actually nerfed, and now deals 10% less than before. It used to be 80% of your base damage. SYLVAN's Lightning stayed the same with 68% initial damage and 25% to nearby enemies from the target. SYLVAN's Freeze is still half a second duration, but now has the 10% freeze damage added. SYLVAN's Fire and Poison damage stays the same throughout the game, while his Freeze and Lightning does scale. SYLVAN's Freeze is weaker than Rolla's Freeze, and that's really interesting to me because in this case, SYLVAN is stronger with his elements over the other heroes such as TARANIS, URASIL, and PHOREN. So while SYLVAN has a stronger version of these elemental arrows over the other three heroes, it doesn't make sense to me that SYLVAN's Freeze is the same as a normal ability Freeze and is weaker than Rolla's. It is not a buffed version while other abilities of his is a buffed version. While there are not a lot of changes for SYLVAN, it does make sense as his buffed abilities were a lot higher than the new ability buffs themselves. I will be redoing the calculations for SYLVAN, especially against Shade, to see how much of a difference this makes. Next, Shade. Not much has changed about Shade. Shade's ability is based off the ability Dark Touch. Shade's ability has stayed the same overall, however her Dark ability, just like the Dark Touch ability, now has a chaining effect and wider when it explodes. Enemies caught in the explosion will have a chance to chain the explosion to another enemy. Not a huge buff in my opinion, it's pretty circumstantial, and when I tested this it rarely happened, I might have just been very unlucky. Last, ONIR. ONIR has no changes even though the Holy Touch ability has changed, which is what his special ability is based on. Probably for the same reason as SYLVAN, his special ability was already much higher than the new changes. In conclusion, I like most of these changes, especially the changes for TARANIS, Bonnie, and ROLLA. I find the changes for these 3 heroes to be the most impactful. This might change the tier list, I will have to check, I'll have to do the numbers and testing before I can say for sure, but let me know what changes you liked the most. I'm really happy that TARANIS got a huge buff because TARANIS is a hero that you can get for free, which is really good for the free-to-play players of ARCHERO. Bonnie and ROLLA are both heroes you have to pay for. At least they're not the most expensive heroes, so there's that. I initially thought that SYLVAN would have a huge change, but after looking into it, it makes sense he didn't get a huge change, but I just don't understand the nerf to the poison ability. I double checked my notes from back then to make sure I didn't make any miscalculations, but it really was 80%, so I don't know why that has happened. PHOREN's change is the most underwhelming in my opinion, and while Shade's buff wasn't super big, it makes sense as right now she is really strong anyway, so they made her just a bit stronger. I will be making a new hero tier list, a new ability tier list, as well as looking into SYLVAN and Shade again in the future. That is all for today's video. Let me know what changes you found the most interesting or impactful. I thank you very much for watching. Like the video if you're happy with these changes. Subscribe and click the bell for more ARCHERO videos. I hope to see you again for the next one. Bye!